Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Ryan A. McDade. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Apple of His Eye. We are a faith-based organization here in Cincinnati, Ohio. We specialize in providing community mental health education as well as wraparound supports for people living with serious or persistent mental health conditions and or experiencing homelessness. If you guys know anything about Apple of His Eye, we typically are providing in-person live trainings in the community around mental health education. But today we're going to switch things up and offer you all some virtual health literacy tools in the form of an interview with a dear friend and colleague of mine. Before we get into the content, I want to shout out our funders, the National Institute of Health, National Network of Libraries of Medicine. If you guys would like any more information about their organization, please feel free to check out the links at the end of the video. Thank you so much and stay tuned. I am here with the amazing, award-winning mental health columnist, Mrs. Nami. How are you today, girl?
I'm elated. I am so looking forward to helping educate people and help bust men on the stigma.
We're so happy to have you all here. And before I forget, I want to mention that not only is this woman a mental health warrior, but she is also the president and founder of Nami Brown County. So we just want to clap that up for her right now because that is amazing. All right, because I'm so excited and I just want to jump into the content, and I know our listeners are excited as well. I just want to go ahead and get started. Is that okay?
Fine.
All right, so the first question that I have for you is, can you share a little bit about your diagnosis, your mental health diagnosis, and what that consists of for you?
Yes, I am diagnosed bipolar with psychotic features. Those are two components to that. Bipolar, the traditional term, was manic depressive. And so that's something that's important to know, is that it's manic depressive was the old term for bipolar. So that's the first one. The second one is a little more difficult, psychotic features.
Yeah.
Now the thing about psychotic features is psychotic features has to do with people that are not in the right mind. And so that happened to me a number of times.
Okay.
So that's what it's about with regards to psychotic features.
Okay. So you said the new term is bipolar with psychotic features. And so can you talk to us a little bit about the bipolar piece in terms of the mania and the depression? Can you give us a little bit more detail there?
Right. So the thing that's important to understand about people who have manic depressive episodes is, now we all have highs and lows.
Absolutely.
But these people like me experience more extreme highs and extreme lows. And what's important to understand is this is a change in behavior. So people can be extremely excited, talk like me, fast today, have lots of ideas, can do impulsive behaviors. They can spend money. They can, we call these negative coping skills. There's drugs, alcohol, there's a lot of different ways you can ride that emotional wave, if you will.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the mania side. The opposite is the depression. People who kind of fall into depression, they become sad. They start examining about themselves. They can withdraw. They start having negative coping skills as well with regards to negative activities.
Absolutely.
And but what's important is we all have these emotions, swings, highs and lows, but it's the severity and the length of the time that is really the critical issue for people like me. If you're diagnosed bipolar, you can swing from being high one minute to low the next.
I think that's important for our listeners to know. So just kind of to reiterate that, so persons diagnosed with bipolar, and we'll talk about the psychosis part shortly, but with the bipolar, that's more of the up and down of the emotions. And I like that you said, Danae, that everyone experiences highs and lows. That's just a part of life. But when we see a diagnosis of bipolar, those highs can become more intense and the lows even lower. And I think what's important to mention as well is that this can happen over the course of either several months or weeks throughout a year, or sometimes in most severe cases, it can happen within a period of 24 hours, where a person is experiencing those extreme highs and lows, which is the rapid cycling that you talked about.
Yes.
I think too, just for our listeners, I want to pause, if it's okay with you, Danae, to talk about some of the mental health statistics. So research shows that about 1 in 5 Americans are experiencing a mental health condition. Post-COVID research is now showing 1 in 4. So we're looking at 25% of Americans age 18 and older that are diagnosed with a mental health condition yearly. Minorities make up the majority. So we're seeing populations like African Americans, persons from the LGBTQ plus community, as well as Asian Americans that are making up the bulk of those that are diagnosed. In terms of commonality or things that we're going to see most common with mental health conditions, we're going to see things like anxiety, major depressive disorder, as well as bipolar. Those tend to be the ones that are most common. However, those things that we don't always talk about, which I think we should, such as borderline personality disorder and schizophrenia, those are also things that people are grappling with in terms of the mental health sector.
Yes. I mean, one of the things that I want to communicate is psychotic features basically are when people are losing touch with reality. Mm-hmm. You know, their brain is actually misfiring, and there are two aspects of it. There is hallucinations, which in my first experience, I experienced it seeing things, hearing things, smelling things. What's important about hallucinations is they can affect all of your 5 senses, and that is indeed a part of your brain. There's misfiring. So hallucinations are important. The other point is a little bit more abstract, but it is delusions. Delusional thinking is a term that probably people are more familiar with. And what that is doing is that's when the probably executive portion of your brain is trying to make sense of these extraordinary sensory experiences.
Wow, yeah.
And so that's a challenge. For me, what happened was I was smelling things, I was hearing things, I was seeing things.
Which is the hallucinations.
Which was the hallucinations piece. And then because of my religious background, I adopted a belief that was a delusion, that I was spending half my time in heaven and hell. And this is very common for people that have psychotic features or experience psychosis. This is a term called religiosity. And so that's an important term. And I think the most important thing to understand is that people are not comprehending reality correctly, because their brain is misfiring and they are in their own horror story in their mind.
Absolutely. And now I want to talk about etiology. So for our viewers and those listening, you know, a lot of times people with mental health get a bad rep. You know, there's a lot of stigma associated with it, and they're not understood. And so what I want to do now is just educate our viewers on, well, where does this mental health stuff come from? So a lot of it is genetics. So these are things that we're born with, whether it's a chemical imbalance or just structuring in our brains that when we were born as humans, we had no say-so over. The other thing that we are seeing in research is that it can be environmental. So we can have what's called environmental triggers that may cause what is maybe underlying on the genetic level to be implemented in our thinking and our behavior. So for example, we can have really stressful or traumatic events take place, as what you just mentioned. We can even be in work environments that are just not conducive for our mental health, and we can be triggered that way. And you also brought up previously illicit drug use or it could even be prescribed medications, and I think we'll talk about that later, that could then trigger an episode of someone. So the important thing to mention here is that this is not the fault of the caregivers, those that are caring for our loved ones, nor is it the fault of those that are experiencing the mental health condition. Can you tell us a little bit about when you were diagnosed, and then maybe talk about how that's been maybe a protective factor as opposed to if someone may have been diagnosed a little earlier?
Well, I was diagnosed in my 40s, and that makes me kind of an outlier if you know kind of mathematical terms. But I was a wife, I was a mother, I was working. All of these critical self components I had learned versus someone who's a teenager. You know, the majority of these symptoms occur the first time we're in a teenager.
Wow.
And those years, you know, the body chemistry is changing, and you know, your upheaval as a person is something you're still trying to figure out.
So let's talk about that for a second. So you just said you were diagnosed in your 40s.
Right.
But most oftentimes we're seeing people between the ages of, say, 16 to maybe 19, 20 is when we're seeing the bulk of these mental health diagnoses emerging. So that means at that point they're still trying to figure out who they are, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that's the grace that you were talking about. We need to give people understanding. I think a critical piece is for parents, for them to understand that it isn't just hormones. It is a change in who they're becoming. And a critical piece that you and I have touched on briefly is the area of sleep. Wow. And monitoring sleep.
Yes. So I want to kind of ask a little bit more about what was your experience like for your diagnosis. Can you kind of talk us through what initially happened and what things were of a support to you to get to where you are now?
Yes. For me, and you talked about this earlier, it was really a toxic work situation for me personally. Okay. I mean, I think the whole idea of trauma is something we in our culture are starting to understand. Trauma can be unique to each person. And so for me, it was a toxic work situation. I'm an extroverted person. You know, I like to communicate. When I was let go, I started withdrawal, you know, and I actually went 5 nights without sleeping.
Wow.
Which was really something, you know, my first psychiatrist said, when it comes to mental illness, it all comes down to sleep. Okay. A lot of people don't know this, but 80% of the people that actually go to a psychiatrist have sleep issues. So it's extremely important. What helped me, there were 2 really critical components that helped me. One of the things during my scary psychotic time was I was taught as a child to pray. And so the discipline of prayer during psychosis helped me stay in touch with reality. Wow. And that's a critical piece. The other critical piece is more of a psychological. It happened to do with my mother coming down. And that is that undeniable, unconscious trust that I had with my mother. Being able to say, Mom, I don't know what's going on. This is scary. And she said, it's time to go to the hospital.
Wow. Danae, you touched on so many things, and I'm going to try to do my best to stay on track and not just get so excited. You said prayer, and then you mentioned your mom. And for those listening, you know, Apple of His Eye, we are a faith-based organization. And we realize that maybe not everyone listening has a spiritual or faith-based connection, but what I do want to point out that the research does show that prayer has many, if not more, of the same benefits as meditating. And so what the research shows for prayer and for meditation is that, as you mentioned, it is grounding. So centering a person on the present and what's going on now, as well as calming the nervous system and helping an individual not to react when urgent or discomforting stimuli may arise. And so it sounds like that's what prayer did for you.
Absolutely. It was the discipline of prayer. It was the trust. Yeah. It was the connection that I still had with people around me. So many times when someone is in the middle of psychosis, they are disconnected with reality. They don't know who to turn to or who to trust. Wow. And that's the critical piece that was the difference in my story that makes it unique.
So I want to shift gears a little bit, Danae, and ask, so what brought you to Nami? And for our viewers listening that may not know what that is, it's the National Alliance on Mental Illness. It's one of the most prominent voices in all things mental health. And I just want to know what connected you to Nami. What did you see as the primary benefits for you? And how did that help with your family rapport?
Sure. Nami is the nation's largest grassroots organization focusing on people like me and their caregivers. And Nami was a lifesaver for me. It took me 7 years to find Nami, and that's the part of my story that I most regret. So that's why I'm glad to be doing this today. Nami is actually the grade school and high school for people like me. They have educational programs that talk about psychosis, that talk about bipolar,
Absolutely.
schizophrenia,
Yeah.
and you're in a class of people like yourself, and that's wonderful because you can share stories. You have someone, you know you are not alone.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, so
I
that's
love that.
critical. The thing is that no one teaches this kind of information in high school, if you will. And so as parents, as caregivers, they need this education as well. Education is the only way that we're going to bust mental illness stigma.
Absolutely.
And so having your family member go through the Nami trainings was excellent for me.
So I also want to talk about this mental health warrior, because that is what you are. Can you tell us a little bit more about that
Yes.
vision and mission?
Well, basically the idea is part of when I was battling for my medications. I mean, it took about a decade for me as well. Part of that was the fear of the unknown. I mean, the reality is for me, there is a very real fear that I could be hospitalized again, but I have to manage that fear. I daily manage that fear through courage. So that's the first aspect of a mental health warrior. We demonstrate courage. The other thing I think is important is my father was a self-taught artist. Art has been a part of my recovery journey over the last decade. And so having the creativity to view my challenges from an alternate perspective is another aspect of being a mental health warrior.
Absolutely.
Faith, as Apple as is I, as is important to me. For some people, it's faith in themselves. They need to foster faith in themselves. For others, for me, it was more tying my belief of myself to God. So faith in ourselves and others, and wisdom to walk out the truth for me.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Yeah, go ahead.
And so we have this year, last year we had the 5th anniversary, first annual Mental Health Warrior graduation party. And this year we just completed year number 2 Mental Health Warrior graduation party.
Oh my gosh.
And the bottom line with regards to the Mental Health Warrior graduation program is that people that persevere and stay on their medications deserve a party.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Absolutely. And so the mental health warriors, it's a movement. I remember we were talking.
Yes.
This is really a movement and a mindset that
Right.
you have to embody. And then you take that and then you celebrate those that have decided to choose life daily.
Amen.
Yes, I'm so with that. So, Danae, we're getting to kind of our close here. Is there anything before we wrap up that you would want for our listeners to know?
Yes, I think let's go back to a little bit about the medication issue. The medication issue is really critical. I said, it took me about a decade to get my medications right. And there's an incident that I want to share with you about a bee sting. I am highly allergic, and we didn't really understand how highly allergic until I got stung by a bee at our property. I went in, my hand blew up like a baseball glove. I mean, so very allergic. My general practitioner, good relationship with him. Wonderful general practitioner. So there is no animosity there. He said, you know what, I'll give you a steroid. It says it might cause mania, but it'll probably just make you nervous. I wasn't nervous. I went into mania. So only 5 to 8% of the people even are affected in that with regards to mania for a steroid.
Wow.
So, he was not being inappropriate as a general practitioner to do that. But my body chemistry is so specific and sensitive that caused me to go into mania. Wow. The most important thing I want people to understand is we need, as a community, and you've talked about our community and responsibilities as communities, we need to come beside people like me who are going through that difficult medication process and say, we support you. That's the message that I think needs to be told. And unfortunately, so many times the negative perception of people like me is that we're crazy, dangerous, and violent. The reality is we have a medical condition that, like all other medical conditions, that takes time to get the right medications.
Absolutely. Wow. I just want to say thank you for being here. Thank you for allowing myself as well as our organization and those listening to have a deeper understanding of what it's like from a first-person perspective of living with a mental health condition. I also want to add too, before we close, that there's life after a diagnosis.
Absolutely.
There's life, and individuals are not to be defined by that. It's an aspect. And I say we because I also have my own struggles, and I don't want to say struggles, my own experiences with mental health. Sometimes anxiety for me is just a lot. And so we are not defined by our diagnosis nor the things that we experience. It's just one aspect. And so I want to encourage all of you to continue to learn about mental health, to take care of your mental health. And before you judge or you stigmatize someone that you don't understand, take some time to find out more information. You might find out that there's more in common with you and that individual than what you know. Thank you all so much for listening. For additional information, once again, please check out the links at the end of the video. Thank you.